Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. You're listening to a new episode of LavaCon, where we gather and share expert insights on security program management delivered with, by, and for the most respected security leaders around the world. Together, we'll explore solutions to the most pressing business challenges unique to the careers of CISOs and cybersecurity executives. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Hello, everybody. This is Sean Martin, and you're very welcome to the Blue Lava community here on ITSP Magazine, where we talk about operationalizing security program management by the CISOs for the CISOs. And I'm thrilled today to have none other than Mark Weatherford join the show. Mark, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me. Been looking forward to this one.
I know. We finally got here, and scheduling and technicalities, and we're connected. That's the reality of the internet and technology. Yeah. And I mean, I guess the point I'll make to kick this off is that we're relying on other things to do this. Right? I didn't build this app, and I certainly didn't create this microphone, just as two examples. In life and in work, we rely on a ton of stuff, and that's what we're going to talk about today, which is supply chain, and I believe we're going to cover third-party risk and vendor management and things like that as well. And before we do that, Mark, I certainly know you, and it's an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show, but some folks may not know you. I don't believe that's possible, but for those that don't, you do so much for the community, and they certainly know you by name at some point. But anyway, a bit about who Mark is, a couple things you've done that are relevant to your role and this conversation in particular.
Well, I guess first thing is, I've been a CISO or CSO 5 different times now, in both the public sector and the private sector. So I'm certainly no expert, but I feel like I have the chops to talk to my CISO colleagues. And I think with respect to supply chain security, supply chain risk management, I work with a couple of companies now, doing some consulting, but also with some startups that are in this space. And so it's become kind of an important point for me. I'll tell you when it started. It must have been 4, maybe 5 years ago. I was asked to give a talk at NASA on cybersecurity and supply chain risk management. And I thought, oh, this is easy to do. And as I started researching it, to give the talk, I realized, holy cow, I really don't know a lot about the supply chain. I mean, thought about it, from an operational perspective, that I'm dependent upon, getting my stuff, and whether my stuff is hardware or software or devices or services, there's a tail that goes along with that supply chain that I better understand it. And I guess at the NASA event, it just hit home to me as I'm hearing other speakers talk about, when they put a satellite up in space that's going to be there for, 20 or 30 years, they have to know the provenance of every single component, whether it's a nut, bolt, and washer, or a circuit or a piece of wire. They need to know where that came from and that it was built, within specifications and tolerances. And it really kind of brought home to me the importance of supply chain. So that was my journey into becoming, more knowledgeable about this topic.
Yeah, and let's start there. You've already started. Let's keep going with that, because clearly I have a cybersecurity background, and when I think of supply chain, my natural trajectory is third-party vendors. And typically that's, well, these days it's software and cloud and maybe a hardware device thrown in there, if I'm running firewalls on-prem and things like that. And then and that's all the security, but then organizationally, you might have HR software or CRM software, but again, it's still software. And I want to get your thoughts on this, because what you described in the NASA world is nuts and bolts, right? That quality there is paramount. It has to last. Well, it has to start with quality and last for 20 years with quality. So maybe reset our expectation as CISOs and CSOs for what supply chain means for the organization.
Mm-hmm. Well, honestly, I still talk to people all the time that still think of supply chain as a logistics problem. And that is, how do I get parts on a truck or a ship or an airplane or a train and get it from point A to point B? I mean, there was, 20 years ago, that was what we talked about when we talked about supply chain. Today, we're talking about what is going into the components that we're using. Who is building the software for the applications that we're using? And the best example is, or not the best, but a great example, I think, is NotPetya. When the Russians corrupted the software of this little application that was used by all these companies in the Ukraine, thinking that that they were going to attack Ukraine that way. Well, of course, as we all know, anybody that's been in this business, you can't just attack one person. There are threads and tangents all over the place, and of course, NotPetya then spread globally. So the reality is that the supply chain, especially third-party supply chain, is far more complex today than it has been, and we're dependent. We're dependent on people that we don't even know, we don't have relationships with, and when you add cybersecurity to this, and you think about especially software, nobody writes software anymore. Well, I should say there will be people out there that'll kill me for saying that, but most software today, most applications today are built using other people's software. Built using other subroutines, other components. Go to GitHub and you find a timing protocol or a little app that does counting for you, and you don't write it. You just go find it and you put it into your thing, into your what you're building. So without really understanding the provenance of all this software, you can be doing things that you literally have no idea what the unintended consequences of integrating that software into your technology. And a really quick example, I was consulting to a company about 4 years ago, and they were doing an acquisition, and they asked me to come in and just kind of help them oversee their due diligence that they were doing with this company that they wanted to acquire. Well, it was interesting because more than 50% of this company's current revenue came from the federal government, the U.S. federal government. Well, when we did the due diligence for this company, we realized that most of their code was written in Russia. Now, this was 3 or 4 years ago, so it wasn't Russia wasn't front and center like they are today. But even then, what I told them was, I said, all of your government customers are going to go away if you buy this company. For you to have a relationship like that with code that's being built in Russia, your government customers just aren't going to tolerate that. So understanding, these third-party relationships, and not just third-party, but fourth, fifth, et cetera, party relationships is really, really important. And cybersecurity has just added a component to supply chain risk management that we didn't think about before. Where creating disruptions, defects, and diversions is often the goal of some of these third parties, and finding their way into our environments. It can be really damaging to us.
And I'm wondering, do you have any examples of maybe that fourth or fifth or nth entity that's part of an ecosystem or a supply chain that is wreaking havoc? I don't know. Is not Petya a good example with that, or?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you could say SolarWinds was an example of that. I mean, that was maybe not that was a second tier, but the way it happened was, without recounting the whole event, we just become so dependent and so trusting of our vendors that we just assume that what they're giving us is what they think they're giving us and what they say they're giving us. So without us doing our own due diligence, without us doing our own, reviews and ensuring that those suppliers, in fact, do know what they're doing. There's a saying that we've said for a long time. If I trust you, I assume the risk that you assume. And if you don't know what risk your vendors are assuming, shame on you.
So that's the big question mark, because I mean, first tier, and I don't know how many. I'm trying to think back now to when I was looking at this space. Big media entertainment company may have had 1,000 first tier vendors.
Yeah, yeah.
And who knows how many those had been, and which obviously make the second tier, but third and fourth and nth. I mean, nth means infinity. So infinity seems to me as impossible. So how do we get a handle on this?
Well, anybody who says security is easy is not in the security business. And we've said it for a long time, 100% security is impossible if we want to do business. Our job is to do as much due diligence as we can as is possible that we know about. What we don't want to do is to have somebody come to us and say, wow, your fourth tier supplier is providing product out of North Korea. How shameful would that be? But there was a report by Interos. Interos is a supply chain risk management company. They put out a report right after, I think it was the same week that Russia invaded Ukraine in February. And they said, there were more than 2,100 companies, U.S.-based companies, and over 1,000 European companies that had at least one direct tier one supplier in Russia. And about, I think, over 450 firms in the U.S. Had tier one suppliers in Ukraine. So you can imagine, how many of these companies actually knew that they had tier one suppliers in Russia and Ukraine. And so when you think about the proportion of U.S. and European supply chains that include tier one Russian or Ukrainian companies, while it may be low, relatively low when you think of the universe of suppliers out there, it increases a lot when you start thinking about indirect relationships with suppliers at tier 2, 3, and other levels that you may not know about. I want to say, I think it was part of that same report, that same Interos report that said something like 200,000 firms in the U.S. had tier 3 suppliers in either Russia or Ukraine. So, I mean, I had this conversation with one of the companies that I consult to. We did some quick due diligence after this, and we realized, our board was going to be asking us about this. Where are our relationships? And, so thankfully, I don't know that we were 100% accurate, but we were 90% accurate, that we could say, yeah, we know where they are. And so that's why I think it's just really, really important to do your due diligence in advance, and know where these guys are.
So that's helpful at the onboarding process, the procurement process, perhaps. There's a lot of legacy.
I know
stuff.
where you're going. Oh my gosh.
So how does, and I don't know, does this fall on your shoulders as a CISO, Mark, to do that work, or do you share the load with the procurement team and I don't know, is there a risk officer involved, or who's involved in this to really get a handle on that?
Yeah, well, certainly your procurement folks, and your risk, if your risk management folks are involved. So I would say some of it is the responsibility of the CISO or the security team. Certainly if they are security components and security technologies. But I've always felt, well, it's kind of my responsibility as a warden of the company to take an interest in this. And even if I don't own it, to ask the questions and make other people uncomfortable with answering the questions. So, we get, that happens to us far too often, where people like to put us on the spot with hard questions. It's our responsibility, I think, as good citizens of our companies, to make sure that, that somebody is answering these questions. And man, I tell you what, board of directors around the world were really sweating it out, still are today, but really we're sweating it out, right after Russia invaded Ukraine, and some of these reports started coming out, and people going, holy cow. And if you think about it, I mean, there are certain sectors of critical infrastructure that are obviously more dependent upon Russia and Ukraine than others. If you're in the farming or agricultural community, Ukraine is like right at the top of the list. If you're in the oil and gas business, Russia is right at the top of your list. Whether they're providing pipes or providing geography or people, you just got to know this stuff. You ask the question. In fact, you're probably never going to get an answer that you're satisfied with, but at least you can feel confident that you've asked the questions and you're working towards getting the answer.
Yeah, and it raises a question for me, Mark, that I like to look at things from the CIA triad perspective, and depending on what you say and the path you took to say what you say, and maybe who you mention and what you say, can kind of frame your thoughts in your scenario you just talked about. And when you mention Russia, I think nefarious and malicious, right? And with that, I don't know. I guess pipes, I think availability, but perhaps with food, I think integrity, right? And then
absolutely,
when you start talking hospitals and healthcare, privacy is important, but also integrity and availability. So I guess my question to you is, how can CISOs kind of get their head around what the risk is to their supply chain without getting caught up in predefined or predetermined biases that they may have from previous experiences, or just that's how the team operates? Or
well, to step way back into the conversation, man, understanding what risk management means to your company is really important. And every company, and I've worked with more than a lot, has a different risk appetite. What one company may say, oh my God, this is a priority 1 for us. Another company may say, it's a priority 5 or 6, or maybe we'll get to it one day. So I don't know if this is answering your question, but you really do need to understand what your risk posture is. And, sometimes it's geography dependent, as in the Russia-Ukraine issue. Other times it may be financial dependent. It may be, there's a lot of different dependencies that your company may be faced with from a risk perspective. If you're in the financial sector, you're worried about, of course, everybody's worried about ransomware, but you're worried about, what are some of the implications of some of these technologies like blockchain that may disrupt the financial industry at some point. And again, this is why, man, being a CISO today, I honestly think it's the hardest job in the world. It's certainly in the technology space, because when I started doing this 25 or 30 years ago, I guess, showing my age, it was I felt comfortable calling myself a security expert because I knew more than most people. Today, man, anybody who calls himself a cybersecurity expert, I think, it takes just a couple questions to show that, maybe they're expert on some things, but nobody's an expert in everything. There's just that it's just too much for us to be concerned about today. I mean, you look at, I always fall back on this, but Momentum Cyber, they're an analyst and financial firm. They put out this every quarter. They put out their it's a slide that shows all of the companies in the
market
space.
Landscape or something. Yeah,
the cyber market landscape, and you look at that. There are thousands of companies on there in dozens of different sectors, whether it's endpoint or encryption or IDM or SIM or SOAR, and I challenge anybody to say I'm an expert in all of these categories and I can pick the best product out of everyone. No one can do that. There's just too much.
So so many questions in my head, Mark. So I think I remember hearing a story where the pandemic impacted production of a particular material that impacted the supply chain for a widely globally used medication. I don't know if it was for insulin or asthma. I think it was asthma, actually. And it was because workers couldn't produce the material in China, and then it just impacted everything else.
Yep.
That affects a lot of people, right? Certainly asthma and probably insulin as well, depending on which one it is. But that's not technology necessarily, but that it could be, right? It could be. So I guess my question is how do you map, or is it, what I'm trying to figure out is there a picture that the organization draws that says, here's our ecosystem, here's the big red spots that, by golly, we can't let anything happen here. This is important from an availability. This is important for privacy and security. How do the companies kind of do that initial work?
Well, this is where I think you have the issue of, you've probably heard me say this before, what I call the Fortune 500 and the unfortunate 5,000. The Fortune 500 have the resources to throw against some of these problems. So they can do that. And you mentioned earlier, and I wanted to say it, I had done some work for a company, and they wanted to review and see who all of their first tier suppliers were. And when we first talked to them, they said, yeah, we think we probably got, 3, 4, 5,000 suppliers. After we did, talk to their procurement, talk to everybody in the company, they had like 12 or 13,000 suppliers. So they were stunned by that. So I was at a talk, and the CISO at Lockheed Martin was there, and we were just having a coffee, a chat, on the side. And I mentioned this story, and he looked at me like, that's nothing. He said, I have 90,000 first-tier suppliers. So when you think of, and I'm getting back around to answering your question, when you think of 90,000 first-tier suppliers, understanding what the spider web of second, third, fourth tier suppliers that feed these companies, that falls into the really hard category. And in fact, I think it falls into a category that most companies cannot solve manually on their own now. Now we have to depend on technology. And that's where, not that I'm pitching a company, but that's a company like Enteros. That's what they do. They have intelligence from thousands of companies, and they're pulling all this in, and they can map out where those second, third tier, and by the way, a lot of people, they think they can create some diversity in their supply chain by having 2, 3, or 4 suppliers maybe providing the same product, so that if one of them goes away, they still have. But you go back to tier 3 or tier 4, and you may find that there's one supplier back there that's supplying all of these other guys. So you still have a single point of failure somewhere in the supply chain. So I think, to answer your question, then, that's to get specific about it, I don't think you can do it manually. We have to leverage technology now and intelligence information to be able to create this map of what all of those relationships look like. I mean, think of it. If you had 90,000 first tier suppliers, how many fourth tier suppliers do you have? Like 40 million? I don't know. It's a big number though. And they're global. They're all over the place.
Yeah. I can't count that high, Mark. So thankfully I don't own this problem, but to your point, I think technology is important. And I'm wondering, early days or companies trying to score, I know there's a lot of work going into ensuring contracts have the right language. Questionnaires have been thrown around. Everybody has their own questionnaire. I guess there's a lot of, even just to go back to the contract, if you map to NIST, or if you meet ISO 27001, or if you do a high trust or whatever it may be, there's some statement that says, please do this and we're going to hold you to it. And then you're back to, well, how do I confirm that they did? And then that actually what they did really matters and really addresses the risk.
Yeah.
So how does technology play a role there then? Because I've seen a lot of stuff come around, but we're still talking about this as a huge problem.
Well, I hope you don't mind me talking about other companies, but again, I think we have to leverage technologies. CyberGRX is doing that. CyberGRX is mapping risk against certain companies, and then they use that to leverage that for other companies that they work with, other customers of theirs. So they're not recreating the wheel every time. If they map, that this one product or this one service or one device, if they map where all of that comes from, then they can reuse that information for other vendors. So again, I think leveraging technology in that way is very, very helpful. And you talked about understanding your vendors, putting it in contracts. Again, this falls into the very hard category of, okay, even if you did it the first time, even if you did it today, and they came to you and they said, hey, we have a SOC 2, we're CSF, we've done a CSF assessment, and we're 5 on all of the categories, and we just went through ISO 27001, but that doesn't mean that that's good tomorrow. So you have to have a process. And again, it's easy for me to sit here and say this. It's very, very hard to do this. But you have to have a process where you periodically go back to these vendors and make them, pony up again and say, hey, we've done that. Again, that's where companies like CyberGRX can really be helpful here. And I wanted to bring out one more little thing, and it really revolves around about business continuity. That's part of our DNA, is to have business continuity, crisis management, disaster recovery. That's part of our DNA as security folks, to be able to understand what that. Well, business continuity plans that address supply chain disruptions, I think it's not new, but it's new from the perspective of when you look at this global supply chain. And I bring this up for a very specific reason. Again, not to make this conversation about Russia and Ukraine, but all those companies that I mentioned earlier that had these Russia and Ukraine relationships, one of their most immediate concerns, or if it wasn't, it should have been after Russia invaded Ukraine, was, am I in violation of U.S. laws? There's the CFIUS and OFAC. CFIUS is Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, and OFAC it's out of the Treasury Department. That's Foreign Assets Control, and these are very specifically directed to foreign companies that invest in the United States, and investments by U.S. companies in companies outside the United States. I remember I read something, and I think it was in the Washington Post. There was a venture capital company in Silicon Valley that all of a sudden was like, they were having anxiety attacks because some of their major investors were Russian oligarchs, and now all of a sudden they're backtracking, trying to figure out, how do we get these guys out of our portfolio? So, that's on the policy side of things, which, when I was at DHS, I spent a lot of time on this high level policy stuff. But it's really important to understand that. I mean, even if everything else is clear, the last thing in the world you want is, Treasury Department knocking on your door and saying, hey, we're going to sanction you, a U.S. company, and fine you and apply civil penalties on you because you have this relationship with somebody, a nation or a company that's on the OFAC advisory list. So,
where do we go from there, Mark? So I think, because we're coming up on the end of time here, and I want to make sure we give a couple nuggets to the CISOs listening. Even just me listening to you, I feel overwhelmed, and I imagine a lot of those listening are as well. If they're a small company with a small team, but are doing big things, and in particular the software space, and maybe that's an area we can maybe wrap with, is, and what can they do to start? Because it sounds to me like they need at least some visibility into kind of the big swath of everything going on. Right. Yeah. So when the question comes, are you, do you, have you, will you, what happens if this goes away? Do we have redundancy? Do we have resiliency? So what's let's say the first thing listeners can do next week to really amp up their game here?
Yeah.
And kind of remove the overwhelming feeling, perhaps even.
Yeah. So two things that are eminently doable. And maybe not doable next week, but they're things that you can start on that are not overwhelming. And the first one is get a list, know who all your tier one suppliers. Who do you have contracts with? Who do you actually have a contract that has two signatures on it, and you're providing them money for services or product? If you have that list, there are things going to pop out of that. They're going to be obvious that you need to dig into further. It's just going to naturally happen. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and again, falling back on this CSF and SANS top 20 and everything else, have an asset inventory. Know what products you have in your environment, software and hardware. I still think that that's the number one thing that every CISO should do. You should know what products you have. And, it is cliche as hell, and I hate to say it, but I'm going to. You can't secure what you don't know you have. And I'm not going to name the company, but a previous company that I worked for, I had a bunch of global CISOs working with me, and we did a kind of a tabletop, said, where's all of our security products and where do we get them? And it was I think I ended up with 8-page spreadsheet of 8-pitch font. We own every security product known to mankind, and probably 10 versions of it across the entire universe of our companies. So, if you can do an asset inventory and come up with that kind of information, you can really quickly figure out where you can start consolidating, where you can start saving money. I mean, again, in this case, in some cases, we were buying the same product from the same vendor, but we were paying different prices at each company. And in other cases, we were buying different products from different companies all over the map. And then we were trying to integrate the results of those products into a single pane of glass, which was impossible. So we were able to gain a lot of security efficiencies out of that, and we were able to save a lot of money. And from a supply chain perspective, we were able to really understand who our suppliers are, who are our first tier suppliers, which then gave us leverage to go back to them and start asking, okay, who are your first tier suppliers? Who are your second tier suppliers?
That's a fantastic story, Mark, because I mean, you just think about there's a lot of risk just in complexity, right? So if you can eliminate some complexity, hallelujah. And the other thing that I really want to point out, and I'm sure others heard this as well, there's money to be saved. If you can be more efficient, a bit smarter, not just buy everything for the sake of buying it, maybe, as you pointed out, consolidate vendors, consolidate versions. There's a business case there. It's not just reducing risk. There's actually a business case helping the bottom line, which I presume for a lot of CISOs would be music to their ears, trying to get budget to do stuff. So if there's a potential to save some money and reduce risk, to me, that sounds like a win-win.
I want to say one thing about this, though, too.
Okay.
I'm not a huge fan of eliminating all diversity in products, because, when you consolidate everything and eliminate that diversity, you're creating single points of failure. So a little bit of diversity is good and healthy, I think. A lot of diversity is bad and inefficient and very cost ineffective.
Yeah, thoughtful diversity.
Thoughtful diversity. That's right.
Well, Mark, no question. I could talk to you for hours on this topic, and perhaps we will have you on again to dig into some other points. But I think we gave the folks a lot to think about and some actionable stuff to take away pretty much near term, which is the whole point of this channel, which is to help your peers, and in return help you do better at raising risk or reducing risk and raising posture. Yep.
And and that's why I am part of this this Blue Lava community. When I told other people this story, when Laz first told me what his intentions were several years ago to create this community, I thought, Laz, who would do this? Who's benevolent enough just to invest money to go out and create a community like this? But anybody who knows Laz knows he's one of the most sincere, honest people in the face of the earth. And he put his money where his mouth is. He's creating this community of CISOs and security professionals, I should say. It's broader than just CISOs, to be part of this, to collaborate and work together and have a community of colleagues where, hey, I may not know you, but I know of you. We're part of the same community. Can I ask you some questions about something? That's the value of a community like this, where we can all work together and share our own experiences and our skin knees in many cases.
Yeah. This isn't about threat intel sharing. It's about experience sharing and real information sharing. And the conversations we're having here are incredible. And I know, Mark, that Laz and the Blue Lava team appreciate you and all that you do, and they're happy to have you as part of this. And look forward to having you on again. So,
yep, look forward to it.
So thanks everybody for joining us for this episode. Stay tuned for more, and of course, get connected to others in the community through the portal, and check out all the other resources available to you. And with that, I'll sign off now.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the LavaCom podcast. If you learned something new and this podcast made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.